for example. So I don't want to propose that there's no direct effect of economic change on violent offending per se. There are also additional mediating and so-called moderating influences that have to be brought into the mix. I'm going to talk about one in a moment. But an important moderating influence that helps us explain the relationship between property crime and violent crime in the United States is the heavy use of firearms in crime commission in the U.S. Where firearms are more available, my colleague Eric Baumer has found, you find a stronger impact of property crime on violent crime than where firearms are less available. And that stands to reason, especially if your measure of violent crime is homicide. So, in Europe, when we've looked at violent crime changes and property crime changes in Europe, we don't find as close a correspondence as we do in the U.S. That, too, I think, in large measure, is due to the fact that while in the U.S. the omnipresence of firearms makes the violence associated with the buying and selling and marketing in those underground markets makes it especially lethal. Firearms are not used extensively in street crime in Europe, and so the connection between property crime and at least lethal violent crime is somewhat weaker. And there are subgroup differences. Do we expect these crime rates, I'm using the aggregate crime rate, all robberies per 100,000, all burglaries and so forth. But it may well be, and I have to now tout my Janet Lauritsen, who's a close personal colleague at the University of Missouri St. Louis and a colleague at the University of Iowa, Karen Heimer, are doing really fascinating work looking at the subgroup differences in the impact of the economy. There's no reason to believe that economic changes will have the same effect on robberies committed by 40-year-old males as by 18-year-old males, for example. Okay, but now we get to the current crisis. We're in the midst of a very serious recession. It's now rivaling the recession of the early 1980s, which was a big one, certainly the largest, by far the most serious post-war recession up to that point. We don't have gas lines yet. We don't have the rampant inflation that coincided with high unemployment of the early 80s. But we certainly have the high unemployment. And yet we have not seen an across-the-board increase in crime, at least as yet, that coincides with that huge rise in consumer pessimism I indicated earlier and the overall downturn in the economy. And given the past relationship and the timing of the relationship between crime and economic change, we would have expected crime rates to begin increasing by now. So what does that mean? At the very least, we have to come up with an explanation for why the timing is off, but we may well have to come up with an explanation for why we're not observing crime increases during this recession. Only time will tell which of those paths we need to pursue. But are we looking at a decoupling of crime rates in the economy? That would be a break with the past relationships. And if we are, why? Here are some possibilities. I have to stress, these are speculative possibilities. We don't have any research on the current recession and crime rates as yet. In the past, economic downturns and corresponding crime increases have tended to be associated with expansions in the street drug markets. The best example is the run-up in violent crime we saw during the mid to late 1980s and early 90s. It coincided with a period of economic downturn, but also coincided with a dramatic expansion in the crack cocaine markets, initially in the larger cities and then spreading out into the smaller cities. So, the expansion of the drug markets may be an important moderator, that is, a condition that affects the relationship between the economy and crime. Absent significant drug market expansion, that relationship may be much weaker or it may be delayed. And there is no, from everything I can see, there is no comparable expansion or heating up, if you will, of the street drug markets currently, certainly of the sort we saw back in the late 80s, early 90s, or even of the sort we saw during the 1970s, during the expansion of the urban heroin markets. We're not seeing that. The drug of concern these days, at least in some parts, appears to be methamphetamine. Yet methamphetamine, certainly in the cities, does not have the crime-producing effects that crack did. And even in small towns and rural areas, I would say the best evidence would suggest the effect of methamphetamine on other crime is mixed. And use of methamphetamine, based on household surveys, evidently peaked now about 2 years ago and has been declining somewhat. So it doesn't look like meth is a problem, as we were talking about at lunch today. It's a health ravager and all the rest, but it doesn't look like it has the crime-producing effects that other drugs in their marketing have had. So one reason we might not be seeing crime increases is we're not seeing comparable expansions in street drug markets of the sort we saw in the late 80s, early 90s, and even before. Maybe it's more effective policing. We talked about this at some length in discussion I had just before this talk. And I think that is the case. I do think that more effective policing is a contributor to crime reductions in particular places, but not across the board. There's good evidence that in New York City, more effective so-called smarter policing has contributed to crime declines. It's not wholly responsible for crime declines in New York, but it's an important contributor. In Los Angeles, I don't know that there's, quote, good evidence, but my strong hunch is more effective policing in LA has also contributed to crime declines there. And perhaps in a few other cities. But what we're now observing are flat crime rates or even declining crime rates in most places. And it's hard to believe that the police departments in most American cities have all of a sudden, at the same time, begun to employ just the most effective police enforcement strategies to reduce crime in all of those places at the same time. In a few select cases, certainly. Across the board, I don't find the more effective policing argument as persuasive.